This is my PowerPoint about reasons and arguments to abolish the death penalty. My name is Josh Higginseeker. This is Justice 414. My four arguments against the death penalty. The first is the costs associated with the death penalty are not economically viable. Second being the death penalty is, in my opinion, cruel and unusual, going against our constitutional rights. Third is it is unfairly applied to poor people. And the last argument is the possibility of innocent loss of life or time from an inmate who may later be found not guilty, exonerated, released early. Situations or circumstances may have changed, and any time spent behind bars is time lost from that person's life. Since the 1970s, there have been 1,539 people executed in the United States, with evidence to suggest that over 20 of them may have been innocent of their crimes, with more than 185 people who were sentenced to death being exonerated and cleared of their crimes. The death penalty has been a controversial topic around the world for decades, with over 50 countries still continuing to carry out this punishment. As well as the death penalty is a punishment that has many factors that are considered to be inhumane, cruel, and having a history of improper application, unfair appeals processes, and executing innocent people, and for this reason it should be abolished. The first argument with the financial burden of the death penalty, the costs for a death sentence are significantly higher than that of a life without parole sentence. The Washington State Supreme Court Chief Justice Richard Guy wrote a paper in 2000 and found that in the 8 death penalty cases from 1997 to 1999, the average cost was $388,680, which is almost $650,000 in today's money, accounting for inflation. These costs result from the requirements to appeal and bring all matters through state courts prior to federal courts. Comparing this to the average range of a non-death penalty case of $100,000 to $240,000, again, accounting for inflation for today's money. The tax dollars spent on the death penalty in cases in courts are certainly a waste, and there are many programs that could better use that funding, including family counseling and crisis intervention services of the U.S., adoption and child welfare services of the U.S., community housing and homeless shelters in the United States, job training and career counseling in the United States, orphanages and group homes in the United States, and community food services, all within the United States, as these services provide help and assistance to the community rather than spending tax dollars simply to kill someone for a crime that they committed. The third subpoint here, the loss of wages and work opportunities. Death row inmates are restricted from working, and while prison wages are incredibly low, on average anywhere from less than $1 to maybe $1 in some very rare circumstances, it would still supply the inmate with some income, whether to be spent in the prison or sent to family members, as well as it allows the inmate time out of their cell, which death row inmates are in their cell for 23 hours a day on average, if not longer. The second argument is the death penalty can be considered cruel and unusual. In my opinion, it's argued by some to be an infringement on a person's constitutional rights. While the Supreme Court in 1975, an all-white male judicial body, determined the death penalty did not infringe on the constitutional rights of people, there is still a strong argument that the application of the death penalty and the enhanced wait times that come prior to the execution are considered cruel and can lead to cruel circumstances. As of 2014, a death row inmate spends on average more than 15 years on death row in a cell, 23 hours a day, 365 days a year. That's an average of 126,000 hours in a single cell, isolated from humanity, only to emerge to carry out their execution. Keeping a person alive simply to execute them later is another topic. This is the story of Brandon Road, a death row inmate from Georgia, sentenced to death for his involvement in a 1998 crime. He attempted suicide the day before his execution was set to take place, but was saved, but also had received brain damage due to his attempt, and they were able to save his life just long enough that he was then executed by lethal injection 3 days later. There's also the topic of botched or failed executions. Some may argue that those sentenced to die do not deserve to do so peacefully, but that is not what the U.S. Constitution affords all citizens, regardless of status. There are several cases of executions where the method of execution has been applied incorrectly, including Joseph Wood, executed in 2014. He took 2 hours to die while witnesses stated he looked to be in pain and having difficulty breathing. Also, Dennis McGuire from 2014, who was seen gasping for air for anywhere between 10 to 13 minutes after a new drug combination was used for the first time. And Clayton Lockett, also in 2014, who for 43 minutes passed out, twitched, and even spoke. The third argument, the unfair application of the death penalty to poor people. It's argued by many that the entirety of the justice system is used negatively towards people of color and people of low income. Poor people are far more likely to not only be found guilty of crimes, but also more likely to face harsher sentences than wealthy people. According to an article from 2001, it was argued that poor people were more likely to be arrested and charged than those from an affluent household. This issue is enhanced by the inability of a poor person to post bail or secure adequate representation. Often this would result in the offender taking the first plea deal they are given, but in capital offense cases, a person could be faced with death and still not have sufficient representation to fight charges and at least remove the death penalty from the table. And then the second subpoint with defendants possibly being found guilty prior to the end of the trial. This has more to do with society and the constant discussion of high-profile cases that are on the news, and we've had quite a lot of those recently. In most high-profile cases, the defendant's guilt or innocence is determined long before the case even begins in the court of public opinion. This is only increased with the rise in criminal acts being recorded and shared through social media, being discussed and dissected by 24-hour news stations providing their own analysis of events. This can certainly sway the court's decision regarding a sentence if found guilty, but also even go as far as to sway a jury's decision. In most cases, members of a jury are either sequestered or are given strict instructions to not discuss the case so as to not be convinced to make a decision outside of the jury room. According to a New York Times article, the first anonymous jury case was in 1977 for a high-profile drug case and was done so to protect the jurors from being assaulted or harassed once the case was over. Today it is meant to keep jurors from being threatened or bribed before or during the case, although this does not seem to be enough to even in today's standards, as just recently, there were headlines of stories of jurors being followed home by news crews and jurors receiving bribe offers. The fourth and final argument is the execution of an innocent person. As stated, although rare, there are many cases that have been covered where there are significant pieces of evidence that have come to light either prior to the execution or thereafter, indicating that this person may not have actually been guilty of the crime that they were executed for. There are several cases in which the person has either been found not guilty or there is significant evidence which promotes the possibility of a person's innocence. One such case is that of Carlos de Luna. De Luna was convicted of the stabbing death of a store clerk in 1983 and was executed in 1989. After a 2006 ABC News story and follow-up 2014 book written by members of the Columbia Law School, evidence was released that all but proved de Luna's innocence and implicated another man named Carlos Hernandez, who had a history of similar crimes and even reportedly confessed to the crime. And then there are cases of death row inmates being exonerated prior to their execution. And this often occurs through things like DNA evidence or possibly the true offender stating they committed the crime. Ever since the enhancement of DNA evidence since the 1990s, there have been many cases opened and dismissed, leading to the realization that cases prior to this may not have been conducted or determined properly. One of the most recent examples of this is the case of Walter Agrawad, who was convicted of the killing of a 4-year-old girl but was later found to be very unlikely the killer, and after 30 years on death row, he was released. There are many more cases of new evidence exonerating a person, but none are more telling of the judicial system flaws and prosecutorial misconduct than those who see death row inmates released from prison. In the conclusion, the journey to abolish the death penalty, many factors are to be considered, including the costs, the infringement on constitutional rights, the unfair and biased use of the judicial system against underprivileged people, and the possibility of executing innocent citizens. These are arguments that should promote thinking of alternatives for not only punishments, but for the system of laws put in place that lead to crimes and punishment. The overall trend of the use of the death penalty seems to be declining as many states have outlawed it completely, while many others have not carried out an execution for many years. There are, however, a few holdout states, namely Florida, Indiana, Ohio, and Texas, that are still actively pursuing death penalty cases, and perhaps with these arguments listed, these can soon change as well.